Cloud Nine, sometimes stylized as Cloud Nine, is a two-act play written by British playwright Caryl Churchill. It was workshopped with the Joint Stock Theatre Company in late 1978 and premiered at Dartington College of Arts, Devon, on 14 February 1979. Written by Caryl Churchill. Date premiered 14 February 1979. Place premiered Dartington College of Arts, Totnes. Original language English. Subject colonialism, gender. Setting Act 1. A British colony in Victorian Africa. Act 2. London in 1979. The two acts of the play form a contrapuntal structure. Act 1 is set in British colonial Africa in the Victorian era, and Act 2 is set in a London park in 1979. However, between the acts only 25 years pass for the characters. Each actor plays one role in Act 1 and a different role in Act 2. The characters who appear in both acts are played by different actors in the first and second. Act 1 parodies the conventional comedy genre and satirizes Victorian society and colonialism. Act 2 shows what could happen when the restrictions of both the comic genre and Victorian ideology are loosened. The play uses controversial portrayals of sexuality and obscene language, and establishes a parallel between colonial and sexual oppression. 2. Its humor depends on incongruity and the carnivalesque, and helps to convey Churchill's political message about accepting people who are different and not dominating them or forcing them into particular social roles. Cloud Nine is one of Churchill's most renowned works. The play was featured in the Royal National Theatre's NT 2000 poll of the 100 most significant plays of the 20th century 3-4 and was also selected for Time Out New York's list of the best plays of all time. 5. The New York production opened at Lucille Lortel's Theatre de Lille on 18 May 1981 and finished on 4 September 1983, and was directed by Tommy Tune with an original incidental music score by Maury Yeston. 6. Royal Court production. Clarification needed. Act 1. Clive, a colonial administrator. Betty, his wife, played by a man. Joshua, his black servant, played by a white actor. Edward, his son, played by a woman. Victoria, his daughter, a ventriloquist's dummy. Maud, his mother-in-law. Ellen, Edward's governess. Harry Bagley, an explorer. Mrs. Saunders, a widow played by the same actress who plays Ellen. Act 2. Betty, now played by a woman, normally the same actress who plays Edward. Edward, her son, now played by a man, normally the same actor who plays Betty. Victoria, her daughter, normally played by the same actress who plays Maud. Martin, Victoria's husband, normally played by the same actor who plays Harry. Lynn, a lesbian single mother, normally played by the same actress who plays Ellen. Mrs. Saunders. Kathy, Lynn's daughter, age 5, played by a man, normally the same actor who plays Clive. Jerry, Edward's lover, normally played by the same actor who plays Joshua. Royal Court and New York productions. Clarification needed. Act 1. Clive, a colonial administrator. Betty, his wife, played by a man. Joshua, his black servant, played by a white. Edward, his son, played by a woman. Victoria, his daughter, a ventriloquist's dummy. Maud, his mother-in-law. Ellen, Edward's governess. Harry Bagley, an explorer. Mrs. Saunders, a widow played by the same actress who plays Ellen. Act 2. Betty, now played by a woman, normally the same actress who plays Ellen. Mrs. Saunders. Edward, her son, now played by a man, normally the same actor who plays Clive. Victoria, her daughter, normally played by the same actress who plays Edward. Martin, Victoria's husband, normally played by the same actor who plays Harry. Lynn, a lesbian single mother, normally played by the same actress who plays Maud. Kathy, Lynn's daughter, age 5, played by a man, normally the same actor who plays Joshua. Jerry, Edward's lover, normally played by the same actor who plays Betty. Act 1. Clive, a British colonial administrator, lives with his family, a governess and servant during turbulent times in Africa. The natives are rioting, and Mrs. Saunders, a widow, comes to them to seek safety. Her arrival is soon followed by Harry Bagley, an explorer. Clive makes passionate advances to Mrs. Saunders. His wife Betty fancies Harry, who secretly has sex with Joshua, and later with Clive's son, Edward. The governess Ellen, who reveals herself to be a lesbian, is forced into marriage with Harry after his sexuality is discovered and condemned by Clive. Act 1 ends with the wedding celebrations. The final scene of the first act ends with Clive giving a speech while Joshua, watched by Edward who does nothing, aims his rifle at him and fires as the scene ends with a blackout. Act 2. Although Act 2 is set in 1979, some of the characters of Act 1 reappear for them. Only 25 years have passed. Betty has left Clive, her daughter Victoria is now married to an overbearing Martin, and Edward has an openly gay relationship with Jerry. Victoria, upset and distant from Martin, starts a lesbian relationship with Lynn. When Jerry leaves Edward, who discovers he is in fact bisexual, moves in with his sister and Lynn. The three of them have a drunken ceremony in which they call up the goddess, after which characters from Act 1 begin appearing. Act 2 has a looser structure, and Churchill played around with the ordering of the scenes. The final scene shows that Victoria has left Martin for a polyamorous relationship with Edward and Lynn, and they are sharing custody of their son Tommy. Jerry and Edward are on good terms again, and Betty becomes friends with Jerry, who tells her about Edward's sexuality. 2. Act 1. Act 1 of Cloud 9 invites the audience to engage with Britain's colonial past, but does so by challenging the preconceived notions held by the audience in terms of gender and sexuality. 7. Churchill also subverts gender and racial stereotypes, using cross-gender and cross-racial casting. Betty is played by a man in Act 1, but by a woman in Act 2. Joshua is played by a white, and Edward is played by a woman in Act 1 and by a man in Act 2. Churchill deliberately uses this cross-gender, racial and age casting to unsettle the audience's expectations. In the introduction to the play, Churchill explains why Betty is played by a man in the first act. She wants to be what men want her to be. Betty does not value herself as a woman. Michael Patterson confirms this, writing that Betty is played by a man in order to show how femininity is an artificial and imposed construct. 8. James Harding suggests that by cross-casting Betty and Edward in Act 1, Churchill is also playing it safe. It makes same-sex relationships visibly heterosexual and normative. 9. The black servant, Joshua, is played by a white man for similar reasons. He says, "My skin is black, but oh my soul is white. I hate my tribe, my master is my light." Amelia Howe Kritzer argues that the reversal exposes the rupture in Joshua's identity caused by his internalization of colonial values. 10. Joshua does not identify with his own people. In Act 1, Scene 3, Mrs. Saunders asks if he doesn't mind beating his own people and Joshua replies that they are not his people, and they are bad. By the end of the act, of course, he realizes the oppressive nature of colonialism after atrocities are committed by British troops, which result in the death of his parents, hence his decision to fire his rifle at Clive. Act 2. The second act is set in London 1979, but for the characters only 25 years have passed. Churchill explains her reason for this in the introduction. The first act, like the society it shows, is male-dominated and firmly structured. In the second act, more energy comes from the women and the gays. In Act 2, British colonial oppression remains present, this time in the armed presence in Northern Ireland. Michael Patterson writes that the actors established a parallel between colonial and sexual oppression, showing how the British occupation of Africa in the 19th century and its post-colonial presence in Northern Ireland relate to the patriarchal values of society. 11. Churchill shows the audience different views of oppression, both colonial and sexual. She amplifies social constructs by linking the two periods, using an unnatural time gap. Amelia Howe Kritzer argues that Churchill remained close to the Brechtian spirit of encouraging the audience to actively criticize institutions and ideologies they have previously taken for granted. 10. There is a great deal of difference between the two acts. Act 2 contains much more sexual freedom for women, whereas in Act 1 the men dictate the relationships. Act 2 focuses on changes in the structure of power and authority, as they affect sex and relationships, from the male-dominated structure in the first act. Churchill writes that she explored Gennett's idea that colonial oppression and sexual oppression are similar. 10. She essentially uses the play as a social arena to explore the Victorian origins of contemporary gender definitions and sexual attitudes, recent changes, and some implications of these changes. 10. Clive, his wife Betty, son Edward, daughter Victoria, mother-in-law Maud, governess Ellen and servant Joshua welcome the audience to his African home with a song paying tribute to England. Out of the song, the action of the play begins quickly. Clive returns home after spending the day managing the troubles among local tribes. Betty greets him and they swap stories about their day's experiences. When Clive learns that Joshua has been rude to Betty, he scolds Joshua. After this scolding, Clive greets the rest of his family, asking his children about their daily activities. After some pleasant discussion, the family welcomes Harry Bagley and Mrs. Saunders. Harry, an explorer, visits the family between expeditions. Mrs. Saunders, a widow, arrives exhausted, seeking protection from the natives. Betty and Harry flirt, revealing their attraction for one another. Later, Harry asks Joshua to have sex with him, and they leave for the barn together. Clive chases Mrs. Saunders away from the house, and, after a brief argument, performs oral sex on her. To escape suspicion, they quickly return to the family's Christmas picnic, where Clive toasts the Queen. Clive and Harry toss a ball with Edward until Clive becomes frustrated with Edward's clumsiness. The game of ball gives way to a game of hide and seek, during which Edward and Harry reveal that they have a sexual history. Edward hopes to rekindle this relationship, but Harry is hesitant to approve. Meanwhile, Ellen professes her love for Betty. Betty, still smitten with Harry, dismisses Ellen's comments as ridiculous. Later, Clive and the men flog the natives as the women wait inside the house. Mrs. Saunders, disapproving, leaves to find out what exactly the men are doing. Ellen becomes angry with Edward for playing with a doll and slaps him. When Clive returns from the flogging, Edward apologizes for playing with the doll and asks his father for forgiveness. When all but Betty and Clive leave for the veranda, Clive tells Betty that he knows about her affair with Harry. He lectures her on the necessity to resist lust, and then he forgives her. As tension grows among the natives, Clive finds a moment alone with Harry to tell Harry about the increasing dangers. Harry makes a pass at Clive, and Clive reacts with horror, offended by Harry's sexuality. Seeking a cure for Harry's perversity, Clive attempts to marry Harry to Mrs. Saunders. She refuses the offer. News that Joshua's parents have been killed by British troops distracts Clive momentarily, as he offers his condolences to Joshua. When Clive turns his attention back to Harry, he forces an engagement between Harry and Ellen. At the wedding party that follows, Mrs. Saunders announces that she is leaving, but before she can exit, Clive kisses her, prompting a fight between Mrs. Saunders and Betty. Disgusted at Mrs. Saunders' behavior, Clive kicks her out of the house. When Clive goes to toast the newly engaged couple, Joshua raises a gun to shoot Clive. Edward sees this action, but does not warn Clive. Roughly 100 years later, Victoria appears in a London park on a winter afternoon with Lynn and Lynn's daughter Kathy. When Kathy exits to play elsewhere, Lynn informs Victoria that she is a lesbian, and she asks Victoria to go to a movie with her. Edward, now a gardener, joins the two women, followed by Betty, who rambles at length about raising children. Betty also mentions that she is considering leaving Clive. Betty lets Kathy play with her jewelry. Note: for the second act of the play, which takes place in London, actors switch roles. For instance, Betty in London is played by a different actor than Betty in Africa. See characters. In the spring, Edward's lover Jerry comes to the park, where they argue about Jerry's lack of commitment. Jerry tells the audience about an affair he had with a stranger on a train. Victoria returns to the park with her husband Martin, who speaks at length about sex and his desire to please Victoria. Lynn enters when Martin leaves and tells Victoria that her brother, a soldier, has died in Belfast. When Lynn and Kathy get into a fight, they lose track of Victoria's son Tommy. A brief panic ensues before they find him. Jerry and Edward return, and Jerry breaks up with Edward. Later, on a summer night, Lynn, Victoria, and Edward come to the park to hold a ceremony for a sex goddess. Martin arrives, looking for Victoria, and they pull him into the beginnings of an orgy. Moments later, Lynn's dead brother appears and relates the experience of his service in the army. Lynn collapses when her brother disappears. Characters from Africa begin to make brief appearances, interacting with the London characters. By late summer, Lynn, Victoria, and Edward have moved in together. Betty has rediscovered the joy of masturbation. Jerry and Edward reconcile and make plans to go out sometime. On a trip to get ice cream, the Dead Hand Gang assaults Kathy, bloodying her nose. Martin and Lynn fight over who is supposed to be looking after Kathy. All but Jerry and Betty leave. In her discussion with Jerry, Betty comes to terms with the fact that Edward is gay. Betty from Africa returns and embraces the new Betty. The confusion of gender. Churchill first demonstrates a sort of gender mismatch with her casting specifications. In Act 1, the gender confusion is literal, men play women, and vice versa. This theme is closely tied to the comedy of the play. One cannot help but laugh at the male Betty's subservience to Clive. Churchill complicates the gender confusion with a sexual confusion. Even those characters not played by opposite-sex actors have non-traditional sexual orientations. Harry, for instance, has a sexual relationship with a little boy. This theme extends into Act 2, with Edward insisting that he would rather be a woman. Churchill argues that the placing of personalities in different sexual orientations in physical bodies is almost random. The great challenge of life is learning to reconcile one's upbringing and one's physical identity with one's true sexuality. The quest for identity. In Act 1, for the characters to act on their true feelings, they must do so in secret, at one point during a game of hide-and-seek. Clive's value system calls for a covering of identity if that identity disrespects England. Clive believes that non-traditional sexual identities are sicknesses that might be cured. Churchill seems to suggest otherwise, that while gender can be rearranged, sexual identity cannot be. In the second act, Betty, Edward, and Victoria, now distanced from Clive, continue the difficult search for identity. Although they are now free of Clive's direct influence, they face the new challenges of establishing an identity in a world far different from Victorian-era Africa. The haunting of the present by the past. Though Clive is not present in Act 2, his value system still has effects on the characters. Betty is still afraid of life without him, and Victoria is hesitant to leave a traditional marriage that is falling apart. Churchill makes the influence of the past more tangible by bringing characters from Act 1 back into the story of Act 2. These characters reappear briefly, highlighting the differences between past and present, but demonstrating that the characters still remember their past and must come to terms with its influence. The oppressive nature of violence. To exert control over the natives, Clive must employ a variety of violent measures. He has Joshua flog some of the tribesmen and his troops burn native villages. In his own home, Clive has also created an atmosphere of violence. Betty punishes Edward by slapping him, and Clive allows Betty to attack Mrs. Saunders when he and Mrs. Saunders kiss. Clive himself is not actively violent, perhaps suggesting the hypocrisy of his oppression. He keeps his hands clean by allowing others to actually carry out his wishes with violence. The violence of Act 1 reappears in the assault on Cathy by the Dead Hand gang. The dead hand of Clive's world strikes once more to keep Cathy from playing with the boys. Clive. The first act's protagonist, Clive is the model British aristocrat, at least at first glance. He puts his duty to country above all else and expects those that depend on him to behave according to his will. Clive believes that sex roles are clearly defined and refuses to accept otherwise, expecting his son Edward to be just as masculine as he is. Almost daily, Clive struggles to keep his family proper and intact. He is a racist who believes the African natives to be savages that can only be tamed by his firm British discipline. Although his principles may seem clear, Clive does engage in an affair with Mrs. Saunders, breaking the standard of fidelity that he tries to impose upon his wife Betty. Betty. In the first act, Betty, played by a man, spends most of her time confused and incapable of making any decisions of her own. She relies totally upon her husband Clive to provide direction in her life. Betty does not, however, lack a sense of adventure. She dreams of a relationship with Harry, wondering what life might be like outside of her own. Betty remains caught between her duty to family and her yearning for romance. In Act 2, a new Betty, played by a new actor, acquires a sense of independence and evolves into the play's protagonist. This Betty is older, however, and prone to long-winded lectures and unsolicited comment. The new Betty finds independence intriguing, but frightening in her relationship to her children Victoria and Edward often seems to be the only thing to keep her sane. Edward. At a young age, Edward, played by a woman in Act 1, discovers a proclivity for feminine things and an attraction to other males. However, he keeps his yearnings in check for fear of upsetting his conservative father. These fears subside, but do not disappear as Edward grows up. The older Edward of Act 2, played by a man, finds that he fits well into the role of mother and wife. He prefers steady companionship to promiscuity, but has difficulty asserting himself to get what he wants. Victoria. Victoria, although unimportant to the first act perhaps because she is played by a dummy, emerges as a central figure of the play in the second act. Like others in her family, Victoria is prone to dependence but has moments of self-reliance. Victoria is usually non-confrontational, preferring the role of peacemaker. She feels pain and uncertainty in her search for identity. Character list. Clive. The first act's protagonist, Clive is the model British aristocrat, at least at first glance. He puts his duty to country above all else and expects those that depend on him to behave according to his will. Clive believes that sex roles are clearly defined and refuses to accept otherwise, expecting his son Edward to be just as masculine as he is. Almost daily, Clive struggles to keep his family proper and intact. He is a racist who believes the African natives to be savages that can only be tamed by his firm British discipline. Although his principles may seem clear, Clive does engage in an affair with Mrs. Saunders, breaking the standard of fidelity that he tries to impose upon his wife Betty. Read an in-depth analysis of Clive. Betty. In the first act, Betty, played by a man, spends most of her time confused and incapable of making any decisions of her own. She relies totally upon her husband Clive to provide direction in her life. Betty does not, however, lack a sense of adventure. She dreams of a relationship with Harry, wondering what life might be like outside of her own. Betty remains caught between her duty to family and her yearning for romance. In Act 2, a new Betty, played by a new actor, acquires a sense of independence and evolves into the play's protagonist. This Betty is older, however, and prone to long-winded lectures and unsolicited comment. The new Betty finds independence intriguing, but frightening in her relationship to her children Victoria and Edward often seems to be the only thing to keep her sane. Read an in-depth analysis of Betty. Edward. At a young age, Edward, played by a woman in Act 1, discovers a proclivity for feminine things and an attraction to other males. However, he keeps his yearnings in check for fear of upsetting his conservative father. These fears subside, but do not disappear as Edward grows up. The older Edward of Act 2, played by a man, finds that he fits well into the role of mother and wife. He prefers steady companionship to promiscuity, but has difficulty asserting himself to get what he wants. Read an in-depth analysis of Edward. Victoria. Victoria, although unimportant to the first act perhaps because she is played by a dummy, emerges as a central figure of the play in the second act. Like others in her family, Victoria is prone to dependence but has moments of self-reliance. Victoria is usually non-confrontational, preferring the role of peacemaker. She feels pain and uncertainty in her search for identity. Read an in-depth analysis of Victoria. Harry Bagley. On the surface, Harry, a British explorer, represents British courage and discovery. However, Harry's acclaim as an explorer masks a deviant sexual appetite. Harry's presence, while seemingly harmless, begins to bring out the deep sexual leanings of the members of Clive's family. Ultimately, Harry is as much a victim to his actions as the others. He sacrifices his freedom to avoid persecution for his sexuality. Mrs. Saunders. Mrs. Saunders, a widow, exhibits a unique sovereignty in a world where women are expected to be dutiful mothers and wives. She is unafraid to wield her sexuality, and she demands respect from the men with whom she comes into contact. Mrs. Saunders has a sense of justice and does not readily accept British tradition and the habits of colonialists. Lynn. Lynn is a brash lesbian, unafraid to let others know where she stands. Nevertheless, beneath her combativeness, Lynn is hurt and uncertain about her ability to be a good mother. She is crass and stubborn at first, but does allow those whom she cares about to get below the surface. Martin. Sex-obsessed Martin likes to think aloud, working out his relationship to wife Victoria in long speeches. Martin often feels incompetent and frustrates himself by overthinking his sex life. He demonstrates a tendency to think for others, which can offend those with whom he comes into contact. Martin does have a giving side, which he demonstrates in his relationship to Lynn's daughter Kathy and his own son Tommy. Ellen. Ellen, Edward's governess, possesses a strong sense of duty to Clive's family. She is also dependent upon them and afraid of being sent away. Ellen, too, is working out her sexuality, and nervously tests her attraction to Betty at times. Ultimately, Ellen cannot reconcile her desires with her lot in life, and thus remains unhappy. Jerry. A promiscuous homosexual, Jerry has trouble staying in any one place for too long. His relationships fail because of his distaste for commitment. Jerry would like companionship but is reluctant to give up his freedoms. Joshua. Honest, reliable and dutiful, Joshua appears to be the perfect servant. He betrays his people to be with Clive. Underneath Joshua's loyalty, however, anger ferments. He is loyal only for personal gain, and his loyalty stops when his real family is threatened. Kathy. Kathy, a 5-year-old girl played by a man, is not exactly normal, to say the least. For her age, Kathy has a remarkable knowledge of inappropriate words and phrases. She seems to harbor aggression, making her susceptible to occasional outbursts. Her disposition derives, in part, from her fear that her mother Lynn will leave her. Kathy's desire to fit in drives most of her actions throughout Act 2. Maud. Always a traditionalist, Maud encourages the women around her to behave as she does. She has a penchant for crankiness when her relatives fall out of line, insisting she knows best. Maud adheres to the notion that women are meant to serve and honor their husbands by taking care of the home. She is a well-intentioned mother and grandmother, but her values seem outdated as her guidance often falls upon deaf ears. Tommy. Victoria's son.